Hey guys, welcome to Boxing Squared for boxing news and views from around the internet. Jared Anderson didn't have it all his own way in his unanimous decision win over Charles Martin, with Martin on 11 days' notice going the distance, taking Anderson the full 10 rounds, the first time Anderson has been taken the distance, and in the process also testing Jared Anderson's chin. Martin clearly took round 5 in this fight, where he actually clattered a number of straight lefts into Anderson's chin, and he had him a bit shook up. Anderson tried to sort of shake it off after the fight and said that he wasn't stunned, but clearly he was visibly rocked and he was having to hold on, he was having to survive, and he was having to try to get out of the way of more shots that were coming his way. But overall, Jared Anderson mostly in control. He used controlled pressure early on as Charles Martin tried to box at range, tried to counterpunch when Anderson, would try to close the distance. And let's face it, Charles Martin wasn't having a lot of success on the outside. He was missing wildly at times when Anderson was fresh, and the reflexes were, he was basically in control and able to get out of the way anything that was coming in. He managed to slip one of Martin's shots in the third round and put him down to the canvas. It was a right hand and Martin didn't see it coming. He claimed that actually he was sort of tangled up with Jared Anderson's feet, which we did see a little bit early on, but let's face it, he was slightly off balance and Jared Anderson helped send him on his way down to the canvas. And I'm sure many of us at this point were watching this and thinking, okay, Charles Martin, will he actually start to capitulate? Is the beginning of the end nigh? But no, Charles Martin managed to hang in there and started to have a bit of success of his own. And by the 5th round, he started to land some left hands. And this is when he started to hold his feet. So when he was moving and circling and looking for counter shots, not a lot of success. But as soon as he started to hold his feet a little bit more, he was able to have some success. And I'm not going to say he was wildly successful all the time, because to begin with, Jared Anderson was just pinging shots to body and head. The jab was landing consistently, and Charles Martin didn't really seem to have an answer. But one of the things that Jared Anderson does, and it's been a feature of his earlier fights, and Tim Bradley on commentary, he was calling it ahead of what happened. Jared Anderson likes to pull straight back to try to get out of the way, and that's a bit of a cardinal sin, and it caught up with him. Charles Martin clatters in a straight left hand, the southpaw Martin, and Jared Anderson, for the first time in his career, he looked stunned, he looked rattled, he looked hurt, and Martin continued to land the same shot throughout the round. About a minute and a half left in the 5th round. He must have landed roughly about half a dozen of those. And moments there, you sort of thought Anderson could be in a bit of trouble here, but he managed to get out of the round, and the next round, Charles Martin basically took it off. Clearly, the effort and activities of the previous round made it so that he wasn't able to really sort of put the pressure on Anderson and follow up. And actually, you had, based on my estimation, Anderson, who went back to the jab and was jab heavy in that round. He was the one that took the round. And from rounds maybe about 7-ish, 8 onwards, Charles Martin was starting to look pretty fatigued, breathing pretty heavy. He was looking to repeat the same sort of success that he had in round 5, but largely without success. Anderson made a few adjustments, and Anderson started to work in more shots to the body, started to bring in the left hook a bit more, and he took control of the fight again. And there was a little bit of a moment right at the end of the fight, in the 10th round, right near the bell. Martin again clattered in a left hand that had Anderson looking like he felt it. And probably lucky for Anderson, the bell went a few seconds later. But this was good rounds for Jared Anderson. I know that there'll be some people saying that they were disappointed. I'm sure there will be. I think some people will overreact to this, but based on the way that they've been bringing him along, this was an appropriate test at an appropriate time. Moves to 15-0 on the back of this one. I think the Zan Kossobutski fight, had it gone ahead instead of late notice opponent Charles Martin, it could have been very interesting. I thought ahead of this one, they're looking to put Anderson in really tough with Kossobutski, also undefeated, who's also a southpaw, but can punch hard. He's accurate and is a very good body puncher. I thought that was maybe a little bit too much risk too soon. And perhaps with this whole visa situation that led to that fight being cancelled, with Kossobutski not being able to get a visa, which still, that looks very suspicious to me. Either one side didn't want it. That's all you can sort of say. Which side, I don't know. But it was disappointing we didn't get it. But I think this fight proved that Jared Anderson, despite calling for top 10 names as he did in the post-fight interview, which we'll come to soon, he needs more seasoning. He still needs to work on a few things. The defense, obviously, is one of those. When he's fresh, he looks pretty fast with those reflexes and he's able to get out of the way. But when he tired, when he slowed a bit, Charles Martin had more success. There was no controversy with the winner in this fight. He outlanded Charles Martin basically, 2-1 in terms of punches, and was in control of most rounds of the fight. Martin put up a pretty credible effort, based off that he was only 11 days notice for the fight. But he had a training camp for a fight that was cancelled, a couple of months ago, and he looked in pretty decent shape, 250 pounds on the scale. Charles Martin, some of the better condition of his career. I actually thought decent effort by Martin, and the fact that he went all 10 rounds and still held the power late, his conditioning was actually pretty decent overall. Sure, he was starting to tire in the second half of the fight, but Martin, with that round 5 effort, I thought that he would actually probably start to gas out a bit, and he did. But Anderson needs these sorts of fights, and it's a bit of a wake-up call in some sense, because Charles Martin is at the sort of tail end of his career. He's a former champion. This gets a bit of name recognition for Anderson's record, but it's not necessarily a guy that's in his prime. He might be towards the tail end of it. But he wasn't a prime Charles Martin, and he was able to clip and catch Jared Anderson a few times, and there will be other heavyweight fighters who would take advantage of what Charles Martin could not. So Jared Anderson has got to go back to the gym and be cognizant of the fact that he can't just rely on his youth and athleticism for his defense to try and get out of the way. He didn't bring his hands up sometimes in pulling straight back. There will be some guys that will take advantage of that. And I'm sure from some quarters, the knives will be out. Some people will say, Jared Anderson, is his power what people have made it out to be? And maybe that's a good question, because Charles Martin, we've seen him sparked a number of times before. Luis Ortiz literally basically discombobulated him and turned his lights out, with Charles Martin effectively knocked out on his feet. Anderson landed some shots where Martin surely felt them, but it never looked like he was on the rack. There were a few times where Anderson would sort of wind up with flurries, but Martin would survive. So, you have to ask about the power. I think it's undoubtedly at 23 years old and beating a former champion who's still regarded as a contender, or, he's on the tail end of his sort of contending portion of his career. But he still was in a recent eliminator with Luis Ortiz. He's been in some fun fights, that one with Adam Kovnatski a few years ago as well. So Martin is not a chump. But Anderson, I think in some eyes, people will say he should have done better. Anderson said himself, ahead of the fight, he wanted to take Charles Martin out in 5 rounds. Wasn't able to do it, and actually that 5th round was the one where Charles Martin really put it on Jared Anderson, and put it on Anderson for the first time in his career. But we do have to say Anderson took some of Martin's best shots. He took about half a dozen really big left hands, and he demonstrated a good chin. So clearly he's got that going for him, but I don't think he would have liked to have taken some of those shots, and he'll probably think, look, it was a little bit careless. After the fight, though, so we'll get to a couple of comments and then the what next. So Anderson said he felt good out there. He said that Martin fought hella good. The punch stats, I did write them down, 157 to 85. And he did try to play down the shots that Martin landed, said that he wasn't stunned. So a bit of a poker face there, but clearly Anderson did feel those shots, and a couple of times he really looked rocked. And there was actually one body shot during the fight. I can't even remember when it was, round 7, maybe something like that. It actually looked like it had an effect and made Anderson grimace. So that's something else that other guys probably in the heavyweight division would have taken note of. Anderson looks like he can be hurt to the body and also the head. He said that there's no specific names that he's calling out, but he said, he's after anyone that's in the top 10. And I guess with those sort of comments, I think I would say this, that top 10 of what? If it's a sanctioning body, yeah, sure, you can find some guys that are beatable and that are sort of at about the same level, or maybe an incremental step up from a Charles Martin. To be honest, I think Zan Kossobutski was a better fight than Charles Martin. I mean, just because some people haven't seen Kossobutski fight much doesn't mean he's actually a lesser fighter than Martin. Actually, I think he's fresher, he's more dangerous, and he's more accurate with his punches. I think one of the things that Anderson benefited at times with Martin, his feet a little bit slow, the footwork not fantastic, and not always great with the reflexes. Kossobutski, I think, scores a little bit higher in a couple of those categories there, and it's a different fight, and I think it's a tougher fight. So I wouldn't mind that next. They almost made it. Make it again. One possibility could be you had Aslanbek Makhmudov, who was on the undercard. I think that's a fight that Anderson would fancy, because Makhmudov just looks to come forward and bulldoze you. Right hands, right uppercuts, and he's a bully boy. He's an on-top fighter. It's a different style of fight, and he would go through probably a little bit of adversity trying to figure out Makhmudov in terms of the, how to sort of dampen down some of the rampages that he likes to go on, where he's just coming and swinging. And we saw again against Ekbajuri, sometimes wildly, and he certainly is open to being hit. He's had a few fights where he's been caught with some shots, but he's basically, like against Carlos Takam, kept coming and tried to just bulldoze his opponent. Ultimately was able to get the win against Takam, dropped him a couple of times. So I kind of like that fight. Also, Zan Kossobutski, and I think there's a couple of guys on a similar sort of level that you could go, well, this is a good barometer. I mean, even a Carlos Takam, I think, at this stage, that's a decent contender. I know that they're thinking big guys, either sort of in that Fury mold, the sort of 6'6" and above, or potentially a southpaw with Alexander Usyk being the other champion. But I think you have to look around and go, what's out there, what's available, and what's realistic. Maybe someone like an Otto Wallin, and I think Anderson would beat Otto Wallin. Wallin is not a very big puncher. He does tire, and I don't think he's particularly quick in some aspects. He's got good solid fundamentals and he's a good boxer, but I do think he has been a little bit lackluster, and maybe his form has been falling off. Maybe he is, in terms of that style that he's got, that's more of a young man style. Otto Wallin is in early 30s now. It's a sort of style that's hard to keep up, box and move. So I do think that the fresher Anderson could beat an Otto Wallin right now. And that would be another one that likely to go some rounds, but I do think that he would probably ultimately get the win there, probably by stoppage. So there's options. It depends what do they want to do with him. They've got some other guys with Top Rank that are on different deals, but I think at this point people are going to be jumping in for a decent payday. They're not going to want to take on the risk without the reward here. In terms of Charles Martin, he was quite gracious in defeat. He did sort of say that Jared Anderson, he believes he will be a champion. He said that he felt that he did all he could on 11 days' notice. And of Anderson, he said he's really good. He's a really crafty boxer. And when he was asked what he's going to do next, he said he'll go back home, he'll get back in the gym, and he'll just see where things take him. So Charles Martin ended up being probably a better and harder test than some people would have thought. And I think ultimately it'll be beneficial for Jared Anderson. One, that knockout streak ends, so you don't have to focus on that. You don't have to take risks, all that sort of stuff. And you can focus on what you need to improve on. Because as he gets higher, some of the guys in the division will be able to take his shots, but also respond in kind. Charles Martin is a guy that's, between top 20 and top 30, maybe top 35. He's not a top 20 guy, I don't believe. So you have a case that there's plenty of guys who are higher that are better than Martin, and that maybe would have made more of some of the mistakes that Anderson made during the fight. So there's lots to work on, but there's a lot to like about Anderson, and especially because he's so young. Anyway, what do you make of it all? Drop a comment loud and often. Hit like, hit subscribe, follow me on Twitter. Boxing_squared. I'm out.